Welcome everyone to the Bunche Center for African American Research. It's a speaker series here. Alex, you want to say something about the next speaker coming up?
The next speaker?
We'll talk about it later. I'm just saying the next one. This is a series.
The next big event after all of you go to your finals and spring break will be our Thurgood Marshall lecture. I'm pleased to announce that just 2 days ago, we were fortunate enough to have John W. Mack, former president of the Los Angeles Urban League, current LAPD Police Commissioner. So that will be April 4th.
Thank you. Thank you.
Oh. As I was saying before I was entering, that we will have John W. Mack. We'll have an informal discussion with him here at 12 noon on April 4th. And then all of you are invited to come to a nice reception in the formal lecture at 5:30 on April 4th at Covell Commons. So please continue to check our website, bunchecenter.ucla.edu, and we'll put information around for that. Also during the month of May, we're going to be very pleased to have another PhD doctoral candidate. Janira, can you stand please?
I too am America, Migrations, Identity, and Citizenship. I look at the Great Migration, but I include the Black immigrants coming from the Caribbean to the United States at the same time period.
Yeah, similar thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Is that
Old school.
okay?
We got the old school.
So thank you. Welcome to the Bunche Center. All the ratchetness is done. No, it's thank you, Alex, for helping us set this up.
You know, we got office space we can still take back.
Oh, yeah. See, this is what happens when you're a colony. See, the colonial, the empire threatens you.
It's called me dark.
So it's my pleasure to and honor to introduce Cory Charles Goody. He is a doctoral candidate in the political science department and a proud graduate of the master's program in Afro-American Studies from that colony of an interdisciplinary program, soon to be a department. Cory's research focuses on the intersection of race, ethnicity, and politics with an emphasis on citizenship, cultural expression, and the cultural expression of political thought amongst Caribbean immigrants. Cory has recently published an upcoming book chapter with a secondary scholar that examines anti-black racism in international football/soccer. Today he will present a segment of his very interesting dissertation research that focuses on the political engagement and group consciousness of black immigrants from the Caribbean relative to the rise of President Obama. So let's welcome Cory Charles Goody.
Hello, everyone. What a day. It's good to see you all, a lot of familiar faces in the crowd, so thank you so much for coming. My presentation today is actually going to be based on my dissertation work, as Mark highlighted. And while I've been here at UCLA, I've been teaching interracial dynamics for a while, and there are some things that I started to take for granted, being a New Yorker, and also, admittedly, being of Afro-Caribbean descent. I assumed that everybody knew what that meant, and so I would teach students in interracial dynamics, and we would start talking about West Indians, and we start talking about Afro-Caribbeans, and when we said West Indians, they were like, so I don't understand how India relates to this conversation. And I was like, oh no, I'm assuming a whole lot. So, that being said, I took it upon myself to let me just introduce some basic terms that you'll hear over and over again, just so that we're all on the same page going in. So we're familiar with the sort of term that we often hear in news commentary about Black America. Who is Black America? And so when I use the term blacks or black American, when I talk about blacks in general, black folks, I'm talking about the collective. I'm talking about people who are African immigrants, people who are Afro-Latino, as well as Afro-Caribbeans, people who descend specifically from the Caribbean region. I was tempted to even put a map just to make sure that everybody knew exactly where we were talking about. And so, and frequently, people from the Caribbean will also talk about the West Indies, and usually in reference to the English-speaking Caribbean, etc. And then, of course, the term that we are all hopefully familiar with is the term African American, folks who, descended from the rich ancestry here in the United States and deep roots in the beginnings of this country. So now that we're all on the same page, these Afro-Caribbeans are the folks that I'm going to be talking about today, and I just wanted to highlight that while Afro-Caribbeans may be a group of people that people don't readily acknowledge or identify as a part of the sort of African American and American fabric, they have been richly and deeply embedded into the history of this country as well as in the present political landscape. So starting from the top left, you have Marcus Garvey, who, as many of you probably already know, is from Jamaica, and Stokely Carmichael was Trinidadian. Moving on, you have Mervyn Dimely, who recently passed away last year, congressman and big advocate here in California. He was from Trinidad. Colin Powell is Jamaican, of Jamaican parentage as well. David Patterson, former governor of New York, Jamaican as well. Yvette Clarke, congresswoman from New York, Jamaican. Kamala Harris, her father's Jamaican. She's Attorney General here in California, as well as Susan Rice, who we know a lot about as of late, ambassador to the UN for the United States. She's also of Jamaican parentage. So clearly, Afro-Caribbeans have been sort of deeply embedded in sort of the political landscape here in the United States. But in the literature, there's this pull and tug about how do Afro-Caribbean folks understand themselves and where do they position themselves. So there's a literature that comes out of sociology in particular, but others have spoken about the ethnic distancing. How do Afro-Caribbean folks understand themselves in relationship to African Americans? And so there's this ongoing conversation how they separate themselves, recognizing the stigma that is attached to being African American, that there has been a sort of a history of sort of distancing and acknowledging, yeah, I'm black, but I'm not African American, and being very specific and clear about that. At the same time, at other moments, you see ethnic attachment, where there's this sort of talk about the collective we as black folks, right? And so trying to understand this is not necessarily just a exercise in recognizing identity, but it's also an exercise in trying to figure out how does that affect our political landscape and their political behavior. So when we look at West Indians, we trying to figure out sort of where they lie in terms of politics. They have had, as Royal Rogers points out, they have had a history outside of the country. Most first generation folks have been socialized outside of the U.S. So they're not necessarily coming into the situation with the same experience of racial discrimination from birth as African Americans frequently come to know. In addition to that, they see politics from through a different lens, right? It's quite different, so much so that it's been said that they tend to lean more towards the conservative end because there's a heavy emphasis on education and economic upliftment, right? So this focus on economics has caused folks to say Afro-Caribbeans tend to be more conservative. They're not sort of in the same sort of bucket as African Americans, while at the same time, once they get here, there is the experience, and as I'll show you a little bit later, there's a consistent experience amongst almost all of the people who I spoke with of experiencing racial discrimination and it affecting the way they understand how they relate to folks in this country. So trying to figure out, so you got these folks and you're like, so are they conservative or are they liberal? I mean, that's how we talk about politics, right? Where do we place them? And with that sort of comes the conversations about descriptive versus substantive representation. Are they more likely to say, Herman Cain's my man, that's my guy, you know? Or is there like Bill Clinton, yeah, that's the one. Or is Yvette Clarke more representative of their needs, given that she is of Afro-Caribbean descent? All right, so this question has been on the table, and scholars have tried to tangle with it, but while we sort of have this ongoing discussion, this guy shows up, right? And we're like, okay, what do we do with him? Not only is America trying to figure out sort of where he stands, and Black America is tussling with that, Afro-Caribbeans, there's a question as to whether they will identify with him racially. And is there sort of a connection there as well as politically? And so we talk about the black vote, and if you're an avid news follower as I am, watching Fox News and MSNBC and all of that, you'll hear frequently accounts of the black vote. It's all going to move this way, with no real in-depth discussion about the different sectors of the black population and how they may understand Barack Obama differently. And so even amongst that conversation, you have these things about these ongoing uses of the term post-racial. He's using a post-racial strategy, and usually that's the sort of specific emphasis on the fact that he's not doing traditional black politics in the sense that he's focusing specifically on black folks, but he believes in coalition building, right? And so some folks have called that post-racial. At the same time, there are others who are talking about post-racial in a different sense. They're talking about, we have moved past race. We are kumbaya, and we have moved on. All right, so I want to engage this conversation about whether Afro-Caribbeans understand themselves to also be functioning in a post-racial context, and how likely they are to sort of join those or be in favor of sort of the post-racial strategy that some in the African American community have really bucked up against, namely Frederick Harris. So the research question that I engaged here was, what impact does race have on Afro-Caribbean views and expectations of Barack Obama and the US government? And so we'll sort of, I'll break this down and sort of show you how I got there. But basically I argue that Afro-Caribbeans do support Barack Obama as both a substantive and a descriptive representative of them. So they not only see him as connected racially, but politically as well. And there is a strong connection to him. And it actually functions in this sort of normative frame of blackness. They see him as representing something that blackness should be. So we'll get on to that conversation. In addition to that, the way that they see politics in this country is truly through a racial lens. The acts in Congress, opponents to Barack Obama, they see as making specific racial attacks as opposed to just political. And in addition to that, the deracialized political strategy of Barack Obama's campaigns appeals specifically to first-generation Afro-Caribbeans who see it as important that he is addressing the nation as a whole. Okay, so it'll become a little bit clearer as I move on. So I'm just going to run through this relatively quickly. Some of my methods. I interviewed 71 Afro-Caribbeans in New York and Los Angeles, all of them being of either Jamaican or Trinidadian descent. Right, and I did this over a period of 2 years, really, and specifically during the first term of Barack Obama, I executed questionnaires and I did participant observations. So I actually went to political events being held in the Afro-Caribbean community in New York and Los Angeles to sort of see how people were engaging this idea of Barack Obama and what he represents. And so some of the things I looked at was identity, interethnic relations, political engagement, cultural symbols, and his presidency. And this is a breakdown of some of the folks who I interviewed. 61% were female. I just want to highlight that because some of the other studies that have looked at Afro-Caribbeans tend to focus on political leadership. And as a result of that, they mostly interview men, because men tended to make up most of the political leadership in the Afro-Caribbean community. So I had an opportunity to engage female participants adequately, which is something that other studies had not done as significantly. First generation, 56%, and 43% were second generation. 65% of the folks who I interviewed we're identified as Democrat. And just wanted to highlight that for the purposes of our discussion today. So I started off with trying to figure out if we are trying to understand the question of race and how race impacts the way that Afro-Caribbeans see Barack Obama. My first thing that I needed to understand was, do they identify with him racially? And in my interviews, a consistent theme was when, into the question, how did you react to Barack Obama being elected president? It was euphoric. You didn't even see American or West Indian. It was just black, African, right? I felt connected. And so there's this sort of Pan-African sense of connection to what he represented and this monumental time in American history. At the same time, it was understood to be a historical moment. So it was connected in terms of a racial understanding and a historical one. One first-generation Jamaican in New York said, "I admire the fact that a black man could stand up and say to the world, all black men are not what you think they are. I was very happy that he was able to change the face of America. I absolutely love the way he loves his wife. He's not afraid to show it. He's always holding his wife, he's always holding his kids, even though it may have happened in other presidencies. But for me, that notion that black men are not as family devoted and committed, I like the fact that the president, that he presented everything that people think a black man isn't. He's intelligent, he presents well, he's a family man. As a rounded man, that is who I would pick to represent me." Right? So in that sort of, in her response, she's not only identifying that she connected with him on a racial level, but that he was representing something that she wanted to put forth about what black people are like, that in a way that the world has not typically depicted African Americans and specifically black men. Right? And it's also worth noting that many of the women that I interviewed highlighted not just him, but his role as a family man, his connection to his wife, and Michelle Obama represented a whole lot in sort of their understanding of him. So, and I continued to see this sort of identification with him in sort of cultural representation. So, just in case folks are not familiar with the Jamaican patois, Obama after me president is basically, Obama is my president. Right, sort of an ownership of him. In addition to that, in a Jamaican restaurant in Lamert Park, proudly and boldly in the store window, you had African Americans for Obama. Right, and so at that point, it's about a sort of universal solidarity, a black solidarity around Barack Obama. I went to a restaurant in Inglewood, and it was a steel pan exhibition. Nothing political about it, right? And I'm sitting there enjoying a beer and talking to folks, and we're just enjoying the event. And someone gets up, someone notable in the Trinidadian community in LA, and says, I'm gonna do a calypso for y'all. And he begins to freestyle a calypso entitled Yes We Can. In this completely non-political moment, he decides this is an opportunity to sing Yes We Can, right before the 2012 election. At the same time, someone is handing me a big long bookmark with the faces of every American president. Note so that it would be apparent that this is the one browner face in the bunch, right? So there's this cultural representation and cultural support of Barack Obama that's really noteworthy and really strong. And so now that I understood, okay, there is a connection racially, and we identify with one another. How do they Afro-Caribbeans understand themselves or understand his blackness in a larger context? And so looking at their views of, forgive me for getting cut off, but looking at their views of government and American society, there were 4 consistent themes. And I imagine many of you might be familiar with some of these themes. Initially, when he got elected, there was a consistent mention of fear. I'm so scared that someone is going to try to do him harm. People even put a cap on it. Like by the second year, I just was like, oh, I don't know. It was just sort of waiting on pins and needles, just praying. Another theme was disrespect. And that came up over and over again, where this sense of, no, it's not just sort of what you're saying to him, but it's even how you're saying to him. And I see a lot of head nods in the crowd because I know that people can identify that there's a sense like, yeah, why is it that when it was Mr. President and all of a sudden now it's Obama, you know, what, you don't get the full name, what, you know, so and even when you sort of look at the presidential debates, there was a sense that Mitt Romney did not address him appropriately, right? And so that theme comes up again. And even in understanding obstructionism in the U.S. Congress, in the House of Representatives, here on the sort of edge of sequestration as we stand right now, there's a sense that all of that is not just a political ploy. It is a specific racial attack on this president as something different that hasn't happened before, right? And lastly, there's a sense that there are unfair expectations. There is no way that he could accomplish all that people had set up for him to accomplish, and they did that because he was black, right? So there is a view of the government and of American society as inherently, as continuing to be racist. In terms of, I asked the question, do you think that Barack Obama's race has impacted his presidency? 64% said it has had a negative impact. 15% said it has a positive impact, right? 10 split the difference, and 10% said no impact. What I also thought was interesting that when I asked, what impact do you think a black president has had on race relations in the United States? 15% said it went negative. It got worse. So it's not just, you know, race is it was an issue, but now it's worse. People are more explicit about their racial attacks. People are, you know, being louder and sort of more in your face, more explicit about race. And those who said that there was no impact, it wasn't that we were doing okay, it's fine, either way or next. No, it was consistently no impact and we were not doing okay, right? This has not benefited us, and this is, I mean, we are proud for him, but this has not gone a good direction. And lastly, 38% said it had a positive impact. And many of the people who actually highlighted the positive impact focused on African American and black community collectively pride. That there was a greater sense of pride within the community, that people walked with their heads higher, that, you know, there was a sense that, okay, you know, we're doing better internally to the community. So, so it was clear that there was a sense that race is still functioning in American society as a whole. Lastly, sort of to understand how race was impacted, I looked at what the expectations were that the Afro-Caribbean community had for Barack Obama. Are they in a camp sort of focused more on he should be catering to the black community? Here's how this is what his presidency should look like? Or do they have sort of a different kind of expectation? And I actually found that this is where the Afro-Caribbean community started to separate itself. And this is sort of the impact, I would argue, about of first generation, of where they were socialized, sort of into race, as well as sort of an experience of black leadership in their home countries, because first generation tended to say it's appropriate that he should be the president of all folks, not just black people. They had a sort of much more, a greater sense that he should not be focused his attention on black folks. And so I'm going to just read this quote. He said, "I look at him not as not being that type of man." And the question was actually, how do you think race has impacted race relations? So the respondent didn't actually respond to the question, but she had a point to make, and it was a really interesting one. "I look at him as not being that type of man. I honestly and truly believe that yes, he is black in there, in sort of the office, but he is in there looking out and trying to do the best for all. I know there is a ton of people out there saying he's black and I'm black and whatever. I don't believe in that. He is serving a country and a diverse country. So if he was going to go in there and just to make us be better, then he could have done something else. For me, it's not the fact that yes, he is for blacks. I think he is doing what he is supposed to be doing, looking out for all. And I think some of us blacks need to start looking out for themselves." Right, so, and that's sort of a division that you start to see where the first generation folks who come from sort of a background, one, of having black leadership of their respective countries, but also, you know, in sort of when you talk to Afro-Caribbeans throughout the literature, you see a consistent theme sort of not being as supportive of certain kind of social policies like welfare. Not because they don't believe it has sort of some positive effects, but because they're not used to that. There is not a sort of welfare system in the Caribbean that functions in the same way, and so it is looked upon sort of as a dependency tool. And so they have this different kind of understanding. So you see their political distinctness from the African American community start to show up, particularly in first generation. But when you get to the second generation, folks who've been socialized in this country, it quickly goes away. So, so just to reiterate, you know, what I saw sort of in this study so far was a sense of black identity and solidarity against perceived racial threats results in a strong sense of group consciousness and strong support for Barack Obama among Afro-Caribbeans. The immigrant population agree with Dawson and African Americans and most people on the left, and I was tempted to say most people with eyes, but disavowing the validity of the idea of a post-racial era, right? We are not in it. We have not been in it. Maybe one day we will be, but we ain't there, right? And then, however, expectations of the president differ between first and second generation, with Caribbean birth and potentially the presence of black leadership work to minimize the radical nature and black politics and reduce claims for major government reform. So on that note, another Afro-Caribbean is Jamaican, Olivia Pope, will take questions. Thank you so much. Yes. So yeah, this is Kerry Washington. She plays Olivia Pope on Scandal, and which is grown in popularity. It's a political drama, and I must confess I am an avid fan.
She looks a lot like Broomhilda.
Oh yeah, yeah. I'm not going to touch that. So any questions you have? Thank you so much for listening. Yes, sir.
I had a question about the difference in first and second generation. And I noticed that you were making that a point there, but it's been, and I don't know if you've looked at other groups, but it's been my experience that most first and second generation of any ethnic group tends to follow the same pattern. So I was wondering if you had any more information as to why you believe that, I guess the second generation is more, for lack of a better word, Americanized?
So to explain why they view politics differently?
Right.
So, I mean, really and truly, I go back to Ruel Rogers' work, and it's, you know, there's been a couple of different studies that have looked at different facets of it, right? So one, how do we explain immigrants in general, sort of their immersion in American society and culture? There are folks who said that by nature of them being immigrants, they are most likely the most ambitious of the folks who were in their country, right? They have decided to leave their place of birth and go someplace where they do not know as familiarly and decide to set out on their own to sort of form a better life. And consequently, because of that sort of greater sense of ambition, that they may be sort of inclined to be less aligned with African Americans and other minority groups here in the United States. And so, yeah, there's that potential argument. I have not sort of dissected thoroughly between the different immigrant groups, but I do lean on some of Ruel Rogers' work that sort of really focuses on Afro-Caribbeans and says that that this sort of place of socialization, which doesn't change, right? So no matter where you are socialized, the idea is that blackness does not predispose you to a specific political perspective. Just because you're black, don't think that you're just going to, that every black person lines up with what we consider black, the black thought in the community, right? That there is diversity there, and that if folks are not sort of socialized or not born here, that they might be inclined to think differently about how the political system should engage African Americans and the black community as a whole. Make sense? Yeah.
Did any of the people you interviewed question President Obama's authenticity and his politics, given the fact that he is half black and half white?
Not questioned, but asserted that that there was this, people identified with him actually on a couple of different levels, but they did say, I just want to point out for the record, he's not the entirely black, he's half black and half white. So, maybe we still don't have a black president, fully black president. But I mean, that was usually said, sort of relatively in jest. But they did highlight that there was a connection with him as an immigrant. Other folks even connected with him as biracial. Right, so a second generation immigrant with parents, both parents are Jamaican, but one was much more lighter complected than the other, sort of saw him as experiencing something similar to what she experienced growing up. And so there are a multitude of levels on which folks connected with him, absolutely. But yeah, no one challenged his authenticity per se, yeah.
Definitely related to that question. So I was wondering about ethnicity. So you talk about ethnic distancing in the African American community, and I wondered, you said they point out that he's immigrant, but do they say, and he's not even African Americans, those African Americans because his father's African, or do they not? That
they don't make that. No one had actually made that distinction to say that he's not even African American. For his blackness, whether immigrant, whether biracial, whether however you broke it down, Hawaiian, however you want to break it down, right? There was a sense that it was a collective. There was black solidarity around that question, right? And so it didn't matter. And so that's where you did not see any ethnic distancing whatsoever. It was true attachment, true solidarity, and real group consciousness. Yeah. Yep. Yes.
When you were looking at your sample group, and I don't know the numbers, was there a specific reason why you looked at Jamaican and Trinidadian? Are those the two largest?
So
Afro-Caribbean, or?
So this is a part of a larger study, and I actually, given that there's this question that you talked about in terms of socialization, I wanted to be able to see if there was a difference. So studies have looked at Afro-Caribbeans writ large and just said, this is what Afro-Caribbeans do, right? And so because I just wanted to keep my eye on whether there was a difference in terms of the country of origin, if there was in terms of how they socialize into this country, I chose 2 nations within the Caribbean. In addition to that, there were some practical needs in that looking at New York and Los Angeles, I could have picked Belizeans, where I would have had a large population in LA, but a very small one in New York. So these were 2 groups that that had significant portions of the Afro-Caribbean population in both cities.
I myself am originally from New York, and so there's definitely a difference in terms of the Caribbean communities compared to New York versus Los Angeles. And I don't know if you saw that emerge in the responses that were given, because I'm from Queens as well, so there's a large Afro-Caribbean community, but my sense in Los Angeles it's kind of scattered about, or it's not as concentrated, or maybe there is, but that kind of feeling of just literally being from Queens, I was in the middle of it, and I wanted to know if you sensed that there was a difference in even the responses that you got in those different communities. So if you separated it out, like Los Angeles, Afro-Caribbean would say one thing, and maybe you saw a little bit of a difference when you got to New Yorkers.
Yeah.
Maybe there was a difference.
Before you answer, I want to follow up on it. And in my experience, I've noticed that a lot of the Afro-Caribbeans here actually go through New York first before they come here. And are they still maintaining their kind of an East Coast view of things?
Yeah.
Because I assume you went to Earl's, Hot Dogs, and Poli's, those places.
So I did, and a couple other spots. And so this is actually the sort of larger project. I have a chapter that's going to be focusing specifically on that, whether there is that difference, whether social context impacts that sort of sense of group consciousness amongst Afro-Caribbeans, right? And so I'm still weeding through that data. But when it comes to Barack Obama, there was no difference. Right? Once again, the sort of sense of black solidarity, larger group consciousness really sort of showed itself to be evident. And so I did not see a difference between New York and Los Angeles in that respect. As it relates to whether how that impacts in terms of coming through New York may have helped to cloud that data. Many of the people who I interviewed actually had left New York for years now. In addition to that, most of the people who I had a chance to speak with came straight here or through Michigan or different places throughout the country, and most of them came here because of education, right? And so whereas folks who go through New York go there with a sort of sense of their job opportunities and a sort of a built-in network. Some of the folks who came straight here came either as sponsors of their parents who had come here before them, and so came directly here, or they came here to get higher education and then decided they were setting up shop. This is a good place to be. So I actually didn't have too much conflation about sort of East Coast identity or East Coast lens muddling the data too much. Mark.
So it seems like the secondary thing that's going on here is that they're defining blackness. Mm-hmm. And it seems like, if I'm getting what's being said here, blackness is defined in very broad terms. It includes pan-ethnicity, it includes immigrants, it includes people that may not have a black parent, it includes a whole range of different things. Mm-hmm. And I also wonder, did they tend to use the term black rather than African American? And did they see African American as a more narrow construction? And was there a general definition of that? But I'm just trying to think about, like, actually the beginning terms that you went, it seems like the project then allows you to go back to them and add some definitions.
So absolutely, there is that definition. As people who study this stuff, we tend to be more consistent with terminology than folks in the community tend to be. But there was a clear sense of difference when it came to certain things, and a sort of a larger black identity when it came to other things. So you're absolutely right. There is a sort of a definition of pan-ethnicity, even if we were to go so far as, in terms of biracial, a one-drop thing going on in terms of saying, yes, we are a black collective, a sort of Pan-African identity. But when it came down to sort of distinguishing, when I asked questions that I'm going to be presenting in another chapter about, do you share the same outlook on life as African Americans, there was distinctions there. So there is a sense that there is difference when it comes to how everyday life is engaged, and even at times political interests. But most of all, there's a sort of also operating pan-ethnicity and pan-African perspective. Yeah.
Going into this, and after gathering your research and conducting your experiments and whatnot, did you discover something that surprised you?
So I'm still digging through the data, and I haven't filed it yet. Well, one of the things that has surprised me, I'd say, is I expected, so when I went into this project, in looking at New York and Los Angeles, I wanted to check, and I know this is not as connected to the Barack Obama question, but whether there would be difference in terms of group solidarity, assuming that because there's a smaller community in LA, that there would be a greater identification with African Americans. And so far, that hasn't borne out. In fact, there is this sort of pan-ethnicity operating, but generally, Afro-Caribbeans, their networks just got smaller, right? In terms of the Caribbean community, like it was just really tight, and then they went outside. Like it wasn't. I expected to say here, like there's a lot of all my friends are black, African American, but most of them said, yeah, I hang out with Trinidadians and Jamaicans and and West Indians, and then beyond that, I have a lot of friends who are Asian, a lot of friends who are white. Like there is it was odd, and where you see sort of a strong attachment to African Americans is in the second generation, right? Because they go to school with African Americans, and so the connection is there. Even so much as some folks saying, I play down my identity in the second generation, right? As a Caribbean person, right? Which I was like, huh? Tell me that again. It's like, yeah, like I wasn't a big flag waver. I was, I hung out with, and some of this might sort of get we talk about issues of citizenship, right? Sort of that there is the sort of big move that you saw in 2006, where the Mexican flag became something that represented a movement of folks who were sort of making demands on citizenship and citizenship rights, was new and different, and something that Afro-Caribbeans, particularly in the second generation, who may or may not have come here legally, sort of saw as, whoo, no, I put my flag away. I wanted people to think I was black. I'm underneath the radar. No, let's not talk about it. So, like I said, I'm still working through that data, but if there was anything that surprised me, it was that. I really thought that there would be a sort of, we're black, you're African American. There would be more of that, and it wasn't as much as I thought. Yeah.
You might actually mention this, but this was really great, and I'm wondering where this fits into your entire project. Like, this might just be a chapter, but
yeah.
This is the project as a whole. And then quickly, I know a lot of times when people are talking about Caribbean immigrants specifically and their identity, they also talk about class, and I was wondering if you looked at class.
So, in terms of the larger project, this is actually one of the moves that I look at social context first and its sort of impacts on identity, and then sort of come to the Barack Obama question to see how group consciousness and sort of impacts political identity and political behavior, etc. And then I look at political engagement. So, are Afro-Caribbeans, are they inclined to sort of engage? How do they engage politics? Because most of the literature says that they don't really. Largely, they sort of tend to stay out on the fringes. But my question was, by looking at national politics, I felt as though it gave me an opportunity to do something different. Everybody who's looked at Afro-Caribbeans looks at New York, and they look at local politics, right? And Miami, right? And they look at local politics. But anybody who is not a political science major or connoisseur is actually more, in my sense, are more inclined to be tapped into national politics than they are local politics. People, although it may seem like it's the closest, people tend to skip it because it's easier to access. And so my sort of focus on national politics, I hope will sort of get a better sense of how they engage politics at the national level. Your second question is class. I have not looked at class yet, but I hope to take a deeper dive into class, especially when I sort of start getting deep into the survey data. Yeah. Yes,
My question was, a lot of times when you live in the Caribbean, this country doesn't like this. We all have our tribes that we don't like. You'll be in Jamaica and hear them say, well, we don't like those Barbadians and that. Did you find, though, the adage that was used here in America when you have two people in a foxhole, it doesn't matter which race you are?
Yeah.
Did you find that?
Yeah. People would say jokingly, you know, we don't like them, but it was jokingly, like, you know, and this is where my sort of own positionality comes into effect, because it rang true for me. You know, I would crack jokes on my Jamaican friends. You just have an X on your flag. Why don't you go somewhere? You know, and they were like, "What, you got a pitchfork? That don't make no sense." You know, so there's that sort of banter back and forth. But at the end of the day, there is a pan-ethnicity. And so there is sort of common support. This is not necessarily a part of my dissertation at this point, and maybe an article will come of it, I don't know. But the Afro-Caribbean community here in Los Angeles actually struggles with that a little bit more than it does in New York. And there's this sort of sense that some things are ours. And by ours, I mean there's a carnival in Westchester, right? And a Jamaican woman who actually graduated from UCLA was a big part of starting that. And so over the years, past 15 years, a lot of other Caribbean folks have come on board. But then there was a push amongst Trinidadians to say a Jamaican woman is heading up a carnival where this is not in the Jamaican tradition. This is a Trinidadian tradition. And so that there's a sense like, we should be doing this, right? And then, and so this past year, you had the very first Hollywood Carnival. And that came out of that split, where it was largely Trinidadians who sort of said, we're going to do our thing over here. So that pops up a little bit more here in LA, but that has not been the sort of focus of this project so far, but I think there's something there to study in the future. Yeah.
I'm obsessed with Michelle Obama, and you talked about women bringing up him being a family man, and I know even for some African Americans, it was the fact that he married Michelle was like, oh, he's really black.
He's got points.
What they said, if they even talked about her specifically, or in connection with her, and what are they saying about Michelle Obama?
Michelle Obama gave him points. Absolutely, especially amongst black women, amongst Afro-Caribbean women as well. It's sort of in particular, they, you know, identify her as standing outside and inside of sort of the norm, right? So the idea that she doesn't necessarily behave the way First Ladies have typically behaved, even sort of with the example of like, she hugged the Queen. Ain't nobody hugging the Queen, like, but that was a plus. It was a sense like she's doing it her own way. She's showing how black folks do it, and she's representing us well. And so, you know, as the sort of quote that I highlighted pointed out, it was the sense that they are the standard bearers almost, like they're the Cosby and Huxtables, and so it was very much a part of how women identified with him as president. Okay, Lori, I'm sorry.
Okay, no worries. So first I just wanted to say I think it was a great presentation, very well put together, and just bringing to life some of the issues, and particularly for folks who this is something that they study, whether it's race and ethnicity, but particularly this group. So it's great.
Thank you.
My question is regarding the descriptive representation versus the idea or the understanding of this group's for universalistic policies and the strategies that Obama has used to downplay race traditionally in all of his campaigns, but particularly at the national level. So you noted one of the respondents, and she seemed to empathize with the need that for Barack Obama to reach all groups, that it's a diverse nation and he's just not he's just not a congressperson or the local alderman or something like that, that he is the president. But having said that, in terms of policy issues, so you have this person that in many ways, in terms of descriptive representation, although it's problematic, they still do represent him more than, say, a Mitt Romney on numerous levels. But in terms of policy issues, what are Afro-Caribbeans, what are they interested in? And do those policy issues align well with African Americans? Or do they align well more so with other immigrant groups?
So, great question. So in terms of sort of what they identified as the biggest issues in this country, and sort of their policy issues were all towards economics, consistently. Economics and jobs in particular. And so that was startlingly surprising. There was not one mention of Caribbean foreign policy. There was no mentions of social policy really either. It was really focused on economic policy. And so they really there was a sort of mainstream, a very familiar sort of what's the biggest issue. And I mean, some of it's built on sort of what we know as the sort of biggest issues of the day, even today with sequestration, right? Like jobs. And what was hammered home in the media reached the Afro-Caribbean community, at least the folks who I interviewed. But jobs was it. So, and there wasn't like a sense that he needs to focus exclusively on black jobs. So that didn't come across. It was just jobs. Colorless jobs, yeah.
So I think stressing that though, in terms of the work that you're doing, and how, so you mentioned Fred Harris, and you mentioned sort of this whole sort of, both in academia, but also in sort of public intellectuals who have sort of had a problem with these policy stances for Barack Obama and not positioning the interests of African Americans to the fore. But your work is showing that in this population, they just what matters to them are these universalistic policy stances. Yeah. So in terms of speaking and being in conversation with folks like Fred Harris and others, you sort of have some value added there that I hope you tap into.
Yes. Yes, committee member.
Your topic was one of us, and you were you've been talking about perceptions of the Afro-Caribbean community of President Obama. Not just Obama, but President Obama.
There you go.
I'm curious to find out if you had an opportunity to look at, maybe even before the 2008 election, of any of his outreach to the Afro-Caribbean community. If it came up whether in LA or New York, because I know that elected or politicians, so to speak, reach out to certain communities.
Yeah, I'm actually been digging into that, and there hasn't been a whole lot there. He even as president, he hasn't been one to visit the Caribbean very frequently, or it hasn't been sort of on his foreign policy agenda. But in 2009, he actually had visited the Caribbean for a conference, and one of his sort of talking points was to say it's a new day in the United States. We are, no more are we going to be the face of looking down on or sort of a pompous perspective towards the Caribbean or the rest of the world. We're here to be partners, etc. Interestingly enough, though, even with that statement, there wasn't very much follow-through. In terms of a consistent connection with the Caribbean. And in terms of the Caribbean population here in the United States, there has been a little bit of work. Folks really, some of the work that I look at in terms of culture, like showing up at some of these big parades, not him personally, but they're sort of big campaign pushes at like the big Carnival in New York. And so, on his page, there were Caribbeans for Obama was, a sort of significant group, and they have a Facebook wall that continues to go on to this day. So there was some push, but it wasn't sort of a significant point of his. It was just a part of one of many coalitions that I think he was building, but not much follow through. At least not that I found so far. Yes.
We're going to make this the last question because Cory has to go.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm going to say.
Okay, so I have two questions. I mean, given the history of Caribbean participation in broader black organizations and politics, it seems odd that there would emerge literature that would suggest that Caribbeans are apolitical. I mean, most radical, if you look historically, if you look at black radical politics,
Yeah.
there's a bunch of Caribbeans
Yeah.
under
Malcolm X, I didn't put him up there, but yeah.
and that seems odd. So why don't you talk about that? And I also wanted to kind of follow up on Lori's. I mean, I think comment question. I mean, I think in some ways it does kind of, to be, I'll put it in the mean way. Your project is a kind of slap on the knuckles of the self-appointed academics who want to define what the black agenda is.
Yeah.
That they're not listening to the ways, and perhaps the ways in which African Americans writ large or blacks are thinking about politics has evolved in a way that some black political scientists have not understood. And so they want to articulate what they understand to be the black agenda, but they're essentially not listening to how the people define what they understand to be what their expectations are from a black president.
Yeah. Co-sign. You're absolutely right. You know, in sort of reading, in reading some of those intellectuals, I actually saw myself as completely separated from, or my work is saying that's not accurate. At least if you want to talk about, and that's the other thing, right? So even some of these folks will talk about blacks and African Americans, and they'll interchange the terms. So it's not ever clear if they're. So it's usually assumed that they're talking about all people who, you know, have a darker complexion and, you know, see their roots as in Africa. But there is a distinction that I do want to sort of highlight, that is not, and that is not the case for Afro-Caribbeans. That there isn't this sort of sense that that's the direction that they want to go, at least in terms of that immigrant population. And it's a growing part of the black community here in the United States. I didn't include the numbers, but the numbers in terms of sort of are continuing to rise in terms of Afro-Caribbean immigration, and who knows how that will shift, you know, as immigration reform seems to be on the horizon. So, because in the past it has marked sort of significant waves of immigration from the Caribbean. In response to the question about this sort of apoliticalness, I'm trying to sort of see what's what's operating there. There seems to be possibly a colonial point of where there's a shift in terms of immigration, where when independence in the Caribbean and the sort of post-1965 wave of immigrants were not as sort of political as sort of previous waves. I'm still investigating that. Let me get back to you on that. So, but thank you so much for your questions.